So as a tutor, obviously what I would refer to this particular unit specification brief, as we call it, unit specification. This is something that we normally, refer to and look at creating all the content and, going through this in terms of the PowerPoint presentation and the sessions that we do, so that you have a good understanding in terms of what's being discussed in this particular unit. Now, this unit, as you can see, typically has, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 learning outcomes. Each of these learning outcomes, has certain assessment criteria. So in today's unit, what we're going to be doing is focus on learning outcome 1 and try and cover all these assessment criteria with regards to understand business environment and the external factors. Now, very briefly, when you look at particular unit business environment, what we are looking at is we're trying to understand how business operates. What is the external environment in terms, when I say external, means factors which can affect the working and operations of the business. We're going to be looking at understanding at some stage the internal business environment as well. So factors which can affect the business internally, or things which are going to be affecting the business from inside. So this particular unit is quite important, is because when we today work in companies, when we today work, in organizations or businesses, it is important for us to understand, the context of where the business operates, how it operates, and what are the factors which can affect the working of the business. Now, workings of the business can be affected by factors which could be political, it could be, economical factors. These could be factors which are technological, employee-related factors. It could be factors which are legal factors. And also, when we talk about factors today, we also talk about, environmental factors today. A lot of discussions and news, if you watch, which is currently looking at things like how, our environment is being affected, how the natural resources are being depleted. So a lot of these factors that we see, which can have a direct or an indirect impact on the workings of a business or an organization, would be typically all deemed within the business environment. Now, here the idea is to try and understand how a company essentially, looks at mitigating some of these factors. And these factors, when I say, for example, if there is a recession, if there's a financial crisis, or for example, if a war breaks out, if you see in Spain, in the Canary Islands, obviously there's a volcano which is erupted, and obviously that's created a lot of disruption for the tourism sector. So in general, we see a lot of these factors can directly and indirectly affect the business environment, or the environment in which most organizations, businesses, work. And obviously, it tends to then indirectly affect employees, staff, partners, suppliers for that organization as well. Now, in this particular unit, we're looking at broadly covering some of these factors. Some of them would be focused on understanding how we look at doing some analysis, because from a point of view of academic study, what you want to be able to do is understand what are the tools and techniques that you could be using to analyze and understand these factors and how they affect the business operations of a particular organization or a business in general. Now, we will be looking at some frameworks. So there are lots of handouts that we have. And the idea of looking at some of these frameworks would be primarily to build an understanding of how to use them when you are in that, when you're working within an organization, and you should be able to use some of this theoretical knowledge in the frameworks to be able to analyze and assess the situation for a particular business or an organization that you work in. So in the first learning outcome, it's going to be focused on understanding what are the factors which externally, that means from outside the organization, can affect the business and the workings of the business. In the second one, we're going to be looking at understanding why organizations need to be aware of the impact of environment in particular. So when we look at businesses which are in manufacturing, when we talk about businesses, if you know that businesses can be classified, we'll cover this in a bit more detail. Businesses can be classified as tertiary businesses, primary businesses, or secondary businesses. And in some cases, look at some of these businesses, they use primary businesses or businesses which basically produce or manufacture things, but they utilize natural resources to be able to produce those goods and services which they sell to other organizations which might reprocess some of them and then sell it further onwards to consumers. So what we will look at in the second learning outcome would be identifying factors which effectively contribute towards the business operational side, but from an environmental perspective. And sometimes burning lots of fuels, or a lot of organizations which use, if I look at the airline industry, they use a lot of fossil fuels, and obviously they have a carbon footprint. So how does that business impact the environment is something that we will study in learning outcome 2. Learning outcome 3 is focused on some of the elements of marketing. So essentially all businesses at some stage have to sell products and services to consumers. And when we look at the key function of marketing, it is an activity through which businesses try and position their products and services, which are then sold onwards using messaging, consumer messaging, sales, advertising, research, and they sell their goods and services to consumers. Or in some cases, tertiary or primary organizations would be selling it to secondary organizations and secondary to tertiary organizations. So a company which produces iron ore, which is steel, for example, is a primary business because it uses raw material from the environment and then processes them into a material called iron ore or steel, and then steel is sold off by that company as a finished product to other types of businesses or sectors like construction industry, or maybe manufacturing industry, or railways and things like that. They become the secondary consumer as a secondary business because they're utilizing it, and then they make that into a product or service which is then sold to consumers. So that particular business, which basically finally sells it to the consumer, which is at the retail outlet when you and me go and buy things, would be looking at selling it to the consumer. And from there onwards, the messaging which tends to happen from the business to the consumer to attract consumers to be able to buy their products and services would be all in the elements of marketing, and that is what we cover in learning outcome 3. Learning outcome 4, we're going to be looking at, after understanding how businesses work, how they are affected externally and internally, we look at basic bits in terms of understanding environment and what role does it play, and then the activities around marketing. We'll be looking at understanding how businesses should behave ethically. So resources are finite, finances, whether you look at administrative, natural resources, are all finite. Businesses are in the business of producing profits and profits for their shareholders and, let's say, different types of stakeholders, shareholders, directors, board, employees, staff, partners, suppliers. But what we want to also understand is some of the basic bits around how businesses need to operate ethically. So here we'll understand the concepts of triple bottom line. We'll understand the concepts of the Carroll pyramid in terms of how businesses need to have ethical operations. So when we look at non-reporting of profits by large companies, or using the system, let's say the gaps in the system to be able to transfer profits from one country to other. We get to hear this in the news that companies like Starbucks, Amazon, do not pay enough profits within the UK, but their businesses turn over, billions of pounds in terms of revenue. So when we look at that, what we want to be able to understand is what are the ethical, dilemmas the businesses have to, or ethical guidelines which the businesses have to adhere to, and that would be covered in learning outcome 4. In learning outcome 5, we're going to be looking at summarizing and completing the unit by understanding how does a culture form within the organization. Different kinds of people work. We have diverse cultures, diverse people from different geographies working within a business. So how does the culture, shape up within an organization, and how does the culture have an impact on the working of the organization? So in this case, we'll be looking at understanding the impact of organizational structure and how does the structure of the organization form up the culture within the organization. So when we talk about things like the organization is hierarchical, the organization is functional, or has a functional structure, or a matrix structure, or a hybrid structure, it has a flat structure, that kind of culture, that kind of structure then creates or influences a particular type of culture within the organization, and that is what we'll get to understand within this. So here we are going to be looking at closely studying a few frameworks, which are Mason's framework, the 5P framework, that we will look at, and we will understand how organizations' culture affects its business and its business operations, and how different cultures can actually, form within the organization. And when we in general talk about, culture within an organization and culture models, we'll be looking at, one or two specific models which essentially we need to be aware of. And that particular, model will be the key framework that we talk about in terms of power, position, person, and role. And that particular model, is model and framework. Hofstede framework, for example, we'll look at that, which is, is basically an author which did a lot of research in terms of understanding how cultures shape up within the organization. We'll also look at Charles Handy's culture framework, which essentially, gives us an idea in terms of how and what kind of cultures can form within the organization when you have power, role, task, and person. He created some sort of a framework. So we study that in outcome 5. So it's a rich unit. There's a lot of content covered, but it's based around helping us develop a bit of understanding in terms of how businesses and organizations work when we talk about them as an independent unit. And because organizations, if we look at different types, they're all essentially, going to be looking at selling, creating, producing, manufacturing, and, obviously targeting and positioning products and services. We need to be able to understand them in terms of what environment they operate, how they get affected. And that is what this particular unit in terms of business and business environment is all about. Now, today, after this bit of introduction of the unit, what we're going to be focused on understanding is some of the main assessment criteria related to understanding how external factors impact the organization. So I'm going to put together, go through a particular bit of few slides, which will give us a bit of an idea in terms of, the first learning outcome. And if you have any questions or any queries, just feel free to ask me at that point in time. So let's look at briefly understanding, before we get into some of the bits in terms of, how do you define business? Any ideas in terms of what is a business, or what do we say or mean when I use the word business?
Supply and demand.
That's correct. Yeah, one way of looking at understanding business would be, yes, if we look at economics side of things, we look at, basically coining the word or using the word, which is, supply and demand. Now, the other bit that we also look at sometimes when we talk about businesses, we talk about maybe an organization or an occupation or a profession in which generally people would be looking at trading. They would be looking at initiating in some sort of commercial activity, or engaging in some sort of commercial activity, and that would be, in simple terms, classified as something called a business. And when we say a business organization, it would mean that a number of people here work collectively, and they collectively on this context to be able to understand and work in, business environment. So when we talk about, in general, say business, what we would mean by that is that we would essentially mean that a lot of people might be working within a particular place. That place would be called, say, a place of work or a business. And here people would be normally engaged in activities of making, producing, selling goods and services. And each of this goods and service that the company or the organization produces is basically done to earn profits. And those profits then, obviously are reflowed back into the business or into the, organization. Now, when we talk about environment, if we just look at the meaning of the word environment, or we talk about, environment in general, just putting the two words together. So now we know what is business. And if you look at the word environment in general, we look at, we would normally talk about the surroundings in particular, or we'll talk about, conditions which are created for businesses or people and individuals to come together and then work within a conducive kind of an environment, as we say, or atmosphere in a place which allows them to work together to produce or create things which would then be sold in a marketplace. So from a natural perspective, we might define environment as a natural world, or maybe, I would class this as maybe surroundings or conditions which allow or create conducive environment for businesses to be able to operate. And when we talk about certain activities which are carried out, in this context, they would be termed as what are called business activities, activities which are being carried out by individuals, by employees, partners, suppliers, different types of people within our organization to be able to produce some sort of finished goods or services which then can be sold in context to create profit or earn money, would be termed as business services. So when we talk about business, when we talk about environment, and we look at the word business environment in particular, that is where the context of this particular unit would essentially, stand or basically come across. Environment could also mean, some of the surroundings which affect the workings of a business. So, for example, if you work within an office, the surroundings or the environment is that you work within an office building, and that would be the environment. If you work, and if I look at the context of talking about environment, and if I say I work as a business manager, but you travel to different places or different cities or towns, travel within the UK, you would be looking at traveling within the UK only, and that would again be different environments. So sometimes you're meeting up with clients or going to different locations, and they would be either a company's regional office or a business office or a business center, and those would then be different environments or different surroundings in which you meet and transact with customers. Now, going into some of the assessment criteria here, what we are looking at is basically understand the first one, and as I go along, we will cover some of the key bits which are given in the indicative content of the criteria. So when we talk about, external factors, in general, before I just quickly go into when I say, external factors, what do you mean by external factors? Any idea?
What's outside the business or the environment that kind of has the impact?
Yep, that is yeah, that's partly correct. So factors are basically influences. If I term and use another word, factors are basically influences or circumstances which get created or situations which get created. So from a business point of view, I might use the word factor, but if I use it personally in a context, in a personal situation, I would say, okay, trying to influence me in terms of my choice for food or maybe my choice for clothing. So it is termed as influence. If I say there are certain circumstances getting created, which means if you have a certain budget to buy a certain thing, that means, okay, I have this amount of money, and in those circumstances, I would buy only this side of things. So when we talk about factors, external factors, we basically are talking about, influences or circumstances or situations in particular, which would affect a business or affect the decisions which people within the business will make. So internal and external, they could be influences, situations, circumstances which would affect the company from inside. That means the decisions which the company directors are taking, or maybe people within the company are taking, could be having an effect on the workings or operations of the business. But if these factors are beyond the control of the business and they are affecting all such businesses in that area or in that geography equally, or are beyond their control, and those factors will be termed as external factors. So when we talk about external factors, it could be factors like political factor. If there is an unstable government within a particular country, that would affect all the companies or businesses. If the changes in legislation happen, or if there's a VAT, for example, if currently in the UK the VAT is 20%, but if the government decides to increase VAT from 20 to 22.5%, that would affect all businesses. And that's a factor which is not in the control of the business. It is something which is external to them, and it will affect them and all the others operating in that geography equally, and they would be termed as external factors. External factors or influences could also mean we are talking about things which are primarily going to be, for example, changes in technology. It could be things which are competition-based. It could be economic, political, legal side of things which are changing in the environment. Sometimes it could be social trends or mobility trends which basically could affect the workings of a business, and they would all be termed as external factors. Now, why they're external, as I said earlier, they are beyond the control of the organization or the business, and sometimes they affect all businesses within a particular sector or a particular geography equally, and that is why they would be termed as external. Now, we need to be able to understand that these external factors, when I say they affect a business, what do they affect the business on? They affect the business on essentially the decision-making process. So if the business, assuming, let's take an example here of, if we look at a business like IKEA. Now, IKEA has operations in very many countries. It produces a lot of its goods and services in China. If we see that how these goods are delivered from when they're produced in factories in China, they're delivered through sea freight or through sea. And if you recall, maybe about 6 to 8 months back, there was a blockage in the Suez Canal, which is primarily quite important passage route in terms of marine environment. And a lot of goods pass through the Suez Canal, which is in between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. There was a large container ship which ran aground, and because it blocked the canal for a number of days, that delayed and created a huge backlog of queues with a lot of ships waiting to transfer goods between the Mediterranean and coming in from the Indian Ocean all the way far from China. Now that created a bit of a worry in the markets, because goods which normally would reach by sea freight in a certain number of days, were delayed because of this particular ship being stuck and not allowing passage to other vessels through that narrow bridge or strait called the Suez Canal. Now, when that happens, this is an external factor which affects a lot of businesses. So assuming if you look at news and if you've been tuned into news, you would see that a lot of timber merchants, industries related, whether dependent on raw materials from China, were all affected in terms of supply. We see it happening also because of Brexit, and we see a shortage of a lot of truck drivers currently. If you look at closer home, you see that last week, Nando's, McDonald's, some of the other outlets announced that they were out of certain types of raw material or stock, and this was because there's a shortage of drivers, which is not in the control of the organizations like McDonald's and Nando's. And because there is a shortage of delivery drivers, the raw material which is required to produce some of the goods that we buy from these outlets, restaurants, wasn't available, and they had to stock out and say, okay, these things are not available on the menu. Now, this is an external factor affecting mostly all the restauranting businesses. And when we talk about that, what we want to be able to basically do is that, yes, these factors are beyond the control of the business, and sometimes when decision making has to be done, there is this particular case of that some of these decisions which the government has taken in terms of Brexit, shortage of haulage drivers, are affecting businesses within the retail sector, the restauranting business. Now, if you have to classify some of these factors broadly after understanding that, okay, are external factors which are primarily going to affect the business from our side, these are internal factors. This is how we would classify some of these factors. So climate, economy, technology, political factors, legal, competition, media and fashion would be factors which can affect businesses from outside. Internal factors could be things like organizational culture, human resources. If you have a lot of people leaving the organization or were on furlough, businesses were not able to operate because shortage of manpower. You look at organization structure, you look at some of the physical assets or resources available to the organizations, and obviously management decision making, they tend to form what is called the internal factors. Now, when we look at external environment, there are lots of different frameworks that we can use to analyze how these factors can affect the business. One such framework that in particular is the PESTEL framework. Now, the PESTEL framework is an acronym which stands for political, economical, social, T stands for technology, E for environment, and L stands for legal. Now, this allows us to break factors down and identify them according to the different types. So, if Brexit has impacted haulage industry and there's a shortage of drivers, where do you think this factor would be classified as?
External.
It is going to be external, but within external, what kind of factor would that be?
Pardon?
So when we look at, the government decided after the polls happened and the referendum, we need to leave the EU. Now, this was a political decision. Now, once we have left the EU, a lot of things are changing. And some of these things are dependent on the decisions which are taken in the Parliament and by our government. So when we see the shortage of haulage drivers or lorry drivers, truck drivers as we call them, and that shortage has resulted and started to impact some of the other sectors within the economy. Now, the decision on which this shortage had got created is because of Brexit. That means we have left the EU. So this factor, which is now affecting certain businesses which are dealing with things like retail, looking at grocery and some of the other types of, businesses in the market, where do you think the shortage of drivers as a factor can be classified to? What kind of factor would it be? I know it is an external factor, but what kind of a factor would you classify it under when we talk about these, 6 different factors?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so this is going to be a political factor because it is a decision taken by the government. Yeah, so, and then this impact of a lot of European Union people leaving Britain because they don't want to give up their nationality, but they want to come and work in the UK. But if you're going to now continuously come in and stay in the UK and work in the UK, you have to apply, or there was a cut-off date of 30th June for the individuals to be able to apply and then apply to remain and get an indefinite leave to remain within the UK, and then at some stage in 4 or 5 years' time apply for British passport. So a lot of people decided no, they don't want to do that, and they left the EU, and that is what has created shortage in terms of the drivers in particular. This is an example of political factor. So PESTEL as a framework allows you, when you use this as a framework or as a theoretical model, it allows you to kind of differentiate all these factors, primarily into breaking them down into different types. And these different types tend to be, the 6 that we look at, and that is what the acronym PESTEL stands for. So if there are factors which are going to be technological, for example, a competitor is able to bring in a new piece of software which improves, the processing of orders drastically at tills, for example, in Tesco, then at some stage others like Sainsbury's, Morrison's, all the other supermarket chains would need to kind of complement and implement that software depending on when they can bring in, buy in, and implement and train the people to be able to use, because that is going to effectively help them increase business or increase the response time with regards to that business. And that would mean that that would be termed as a technological factor. So a competitor has taken advantage by installing or using a new piece of software which reduces the time in terms of either processing orders, and sooner or later other competitors will have to follow suit. And because that factor is making them lose business, then in those cases, that would mean that that would be a technological factor. So this particular framework, in short, allows you to classify and differentiate between different type of factors which can affect the business externally. And one of the frameworks that is commonly used to do this is the PESTEL framework. Is that okay? And in subsequent slides, what I've done is I've explained of these individual factors like political, economic, social, and technological, and they will then help you understand, some of these factors which are, using this framework allow us to understand some of these factors and how they can affect the business. Now, this is an example that I've taken here of, say, Dubai, and in this case, I've looked at, in the UK, for example, we have different ports in which shipments arrive, from outside. When we say outside, what I mean by that is you have Heathrow and you have Dover port, and you have some of these ports wherein international shipments can arrive, through the marine route. Now, similarly, taking an example of how PESTEL analysis would be utilized to look at understanding how the flow of traffic could affect a particular port. I've taken up an example here of the Dubai port, and what I've done is I've looked at on this slide, classifying some of the factors, how it can affect the operations of port and logistics side of things in Dubai, and some of the external factors, how it can affect the business transactions for that particular port. So there are lots of different types of examples that we can take, and what you should be able to do is look at creating your own example by studying a company of your choice, and then looking at what factors can affect the business externally, and divide them into these 6 types, and that will give you a broader understanding of how PESTEL framework actually works. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's go across to the second assessment criteria, which basically covers, why organizations carry out PESTEL analysis. So that's the second part that we want to look at. Now, when we talk about why do you think organizations would have a need to be able to understand what factors or influences or circumstances are affecting them externally? What could be the bare reasons that, why they need to study how it could affect their business or business decision-making ability?
So they can avoid it.
Correct. So sometimes what happens is, if you anticipate things beforehand, what it allows the business to do is to avoid those issues and problems. In some cases, sometimes if they are anticipated as they go along, then they have to look at coming up with solutions which will allow them to mitigate those factors. That means they will have to come up with solutions to see how they can go past that particular problem or an issue which has got created. And in those cases, the idea would be to try and analyze them in a bit more detail to see how they can look at getting rid of those factors. So when we look at, say, for example, understanding, PESTEL in particular, the idea of understanding and using PESTEL as a framework is to kind of, let's say, break, the problems or issues down, and that allows us to look at broadly doing fact finding where the problem is, identify the problem, and then basically solve it. So if I say in another word, rephrase it, what I would say is that it helps the organization kind of establish, what would be the factors or influences affecting it and affecting its decision-making ability, and how would these decisions then actually impact the workability of the organization. So an organization can normally not, directly control some of these factors, but what it can do is primarily mitigate or come up with solutions which will allow it to negate, reduce, or deflect some of these issues and problems, and that allows it to still continue functioning within the broader business environment. Now, when we talk about these factors which can affect the business, what we also look at, organizations sometimes essentially have goals. You have lots of goals and objectives. Personally, I have goals and objectives. You have goals and objectives. But what we want to be able to do is classify these goals and objectives into a particular order. Now, these goals that organizations normally have, if I say let's say if I make a statement and as a chief executive of the organization or a director of the organization, I say that this year what we want to be able to do is let's look at a hypothetical organization, EC, and that organization has a turnover of say 10 million. And the chief executive or the director of the organization says that in the year 2022, we want to double our turnover. So that means we want to be, let's say 100,000, forget million, And what he wants to do in 2022 is double that turnover to 200,000. Now, when that statement is made, or when he shares that with some of those associates, people within management or staff and employees in the organization, one of the key questions which they will have in mind is that how will we double the turnover? How can this be achieved? So in some cases, what we do is when we look at analyzing some of these goals and objectives, we use another term called SMART. And SMART is an acronym which actually stands for specific, measurable, achievable, real, and time-bound goals. So essentially what the organizations need to have, or if your manager gives you a goal that we double our sales next month, their goals need to be classified into something called the SMART template. And that is where you need to look at whether these goals are achievable, whether these goals are realistic. R stands for realistic, whether these goals can be achieved in the time frame which is being allocated, and those allow, and using SMART and put goals and objectives into this format allows you to understand whether they can be achieved, or they are realistic or unrealistic, and they be achieved or not achieved within the time frame which has been given. And this looks at the beginning of how you classify some of these goals and objectives, and then look at the pros and cons of how this could be done, or the rationale to this decision could be made, and then you put them through what is called the PESTEL analysis. Now, some of the basic bits that we look at in terms of understanding PESTEL, how do you identify the most important issues which are going to be affecting the business? Whether it's basically affecting a decision that the business is taking or a manager is taking, or in some cases, is it affecting one to many when the decision is being taken? And the other area that you look at, which is quite important, is how do you decide that what information is to be collected and by whom it has to be collected? So people who collect information when it comes to external factors affecting, like one of the key things in the organization would be the finance manager would be keeping a tab on what is the interest rates, which are being given by the bank. Is there an inflation or deflation happening in the market? And they are the key people within the organization who would understand this, is because if the company borrows money, for example, for payroll at the end of the month to pay the employees and gets an overdraft from the bank, but if the interest rate increases, they would end up paying more interest. So who is the best person to understand this in the organization? And the best person in that case would be either somebody in finance or in accounts, because he or she would know that if the overdraft has to be arranged and there are 50 employees, and if the interest rate rises by 0.5% or 0.25%, that would mean that our interest payments next month would rise from, say, X amount to Y amount. So it is important when we look at PESTEL analysis, what are the issues and who and what information is collected in order to put this into some sort of an analysis by deciding on what factors affect the business. Now, we also need to look at where do we collect this information from and how much of this information is actually gathered. Now, sometimes when you look at the information, you have to gather this information which is going to be statistically backed up. It is from a reliable source. You can't gather this information just because somebody's tweeted that the interest rates are going to rise next month, and basis that you start doing some mitigation. No. So source of information and how frequently it is gathered and where it is stored and how it can be retrieved also need to be looked at when we talk about PESTEL analysis. We also then look at, once the information has been collected, how do we analyze it, how do we develop it, how do we data mine it to ensure that this comes out with meaningful figures or some sort of charts and graphs which will allow the management to make decisions. So if I look at an example here in terms of analyzing the information. Now, have you shopped at Tesco's, or have you shopped at any supermarket recently in the last few weeks, days? So when you shop at any supermarket, you get a till receipt. Now that till receipt primarily tends to be, a receipt having a lot of your transactions, primarily related to, let's say, you bought some grocery, you bought this, you bought that, and that. Now, information to you is a piece of information because it tells you how much you've spent in that visit. But if I look at all such till receipts, across hundreds and thousands and millions of customers which Tesco collects every month, how would that data be useful for management? So somebody in the organization using software, IT technology, data mines that data and creates meaningful charts and analysis to explain what customers are actually shopping for in the stores. And that is the analysis of findings which is done using the software. And that software allows it to be categorized into some sort of, meaningful information for decision making. And that allows, for example, it would say that this month in September, 16 customers came across and shopped at Tesco store. Now, if I look at 16 million receipts, that wouldn't make any sense. But for the management, 16 million would mean that, okay, whether we've had an increase in footfall in the stores or whether that was lower footfall which was in the previous month, and that would be meaningful data for them. And these are then crystallized into reports, which then allow people with various types of access to be able to gain access to the data and then use for decision making. So typically, when we talk about PESTEL analysis, you would be looking at, say for example, if I look at PESTEL analysis, lots of information has come out. But I talk about E, for example, economic. Now, a lot of data has been analyzed for Tesco receipts, and the company has come out with certain types of statements or findings. One of the findings was that the company has sold goods worth, say, just hypothetically speaking, 1.2 billion this month. Now, that is economic data which is useful for the accountants, the financial controller, the CFO of the organization, because it allows him to plan what could be the expenses or the borrowings that they need to take from the bank in order to sustain the work of the stores and buying of inventory or purchase of inventory from suppliers and partners to be able to restock the stores for October. So that data economically in terms of output, in terms of turnover, is important for maybe the finance department in particular. But if I look at the data which is coming out from saying that, okay, because the bank interest rates increased by 0.25%, and that has led to an increase in payments of interest overdrafts to the bank for Tesco, and that data is going to be more useful, for the management, because they would say that, okay, these are the expenses which could be shaved off, these are the expenses which could be reduced, or the overdrafts could be reduced in certain areas, and that would be because it's political, because the change of interest rate or the rise in inflation is affected by decision making which is done in the government or in the Bank of England. And that would be of more use to senior management who are involved in running and day-to-day operations of the company and understanding how they can reduce these expenses. So if you see, PESTEL analysis allows people or different types of people working within the organization to be able to use this as a bit of a framework and to analyze different factors, how they are affecting different businesses, different working environment or working conditions within an organization. Now, there are also limitations. There are some positives of this framework, but there are lots of limitations of this framework. These limitations tend to be that sometimes you have to look at lots of information and you have to simplify them to be able to use it for decision making, because you're getting information from political side, economic side, social factor side. If the trends, for example, what consumers are buying is changing, that would be termed as a social trend that people are buying online now. And if as a store, they do not invest in the e-commerce infrastructure, they'd be losing out on, sales, and Amazon would be taking away a lot of sales from them. So when you look at a lot of this information coming in and a lot of different types of factors affecting it, sometimes data has to be oversimplified or it has to be put into very simple terms. And that tends to be one of the limitations of this particular, framework. Too much information being produced by this framework is also a limitation, because sometimes you can get overwhelmed by the different types of information which is being assimilated in order to come to a decision, and that makes it diluted, or that makes it too lenient for it to work as a bit of a framework for strategic decision making. So this framework, from a limitation point of view, is something that can be used in the operational side or in the lower management, but for middle and senior management, this is too much information in terms of data being produced because of the analysis, and that might not be suitable for decision making, which happens at the senior level. Any questions on this so far?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Now, in the third assessment criteria, we're looking at understanding what are the three-step crisis management procedure. Now, when we talk about this three-step management procedure, what we are basically looking at is because there are lots of different factors can affect, the decision making within the organization. What we need to be able to do is, when crisis does happen, when problems arise, how does management or what does the organization do in order for it to be able to solve these problems? So if I look at the three-step process, first step is lots of things which will go wrong, and that would kind of alert different people within the organization, saying that there are things which are not happening as per plan or as per the plan given, and that is where they get a sense of that there is some sort of a crisis which is going to develop. So that would be pre-crisis. Then there is obviously the thing has happened, the accident has happened, or the bad news has come out, or something has got broken, depending on what kind of business is it, situation is it. So essentially, you are in the crisis. And when that crisis happens, you're basically going to be looking at crisis response. That means you're going to try and respond best to solve that situation or that problem, and that would be termed as, crisis response. Now, once the crisis has passed, that means if manufacturing organization and one of the main machinery which is utilized in the produce or process the raw material breaks down, then the whole factory stops and the whole process of manufacturing stops. Now, if that was happening, there would have been some signs which the machine was showing of wear and tear, maybe not enough, maintenance was being done on time, and because the machine was being overworked, overheated, that led to its problem in terms of it breaking down. So the breakdown, the non-maintenance happening and running it over a certain point in time, one shift which was allowed to be run, there were two shifts being run, and at some stage this was something which was going to happen. So that was pre-crisis. When the machine breaks down, that is the crisis. That means the whole setup in the factory stops. Then engineers are called, they look into the problem, diagnose it, change certain parts, make the machine working, and the crisis goes, slowly and gradually grows behind the company. And the machine's reworking, it restarts, it reworks, and obviously the production in the factory again starts. That part would be called the post-crisis. That means lessons will have to be learned, and managers or people in the management would then look at putting things into place to try and understand that in order to avoid this situation to happen again, what they would need to do in terms to make certain changes, and that would be done, which is something called post-crisis. Now, when we look at this particular three-step process, what we want to be able to do is, if I have to relate this to an organization, we will look at breaking it down into different departments. So it could be departments like HR, R&D, finance, procurement, HR, sales, operations, engineering. You could look at marketing, research, and all these factors, all these departments essentially would be looking at, controlling certain factors or situations so that this does not arrive in the future. Now, when we talk about some of these external factors and we relate them to certain department types who are going to be, geared to basically dealing with these problems as they arise. Now, example, in an organization, for example, if there's a strike which breaks out, which department do you think would be responsible for basically going out and talking to the unions?
Nestles? Wait, no, I don't know.
So in terms of human resources in particular, so if a strike which happens, there's a union action which is happening, or balloting which is happening for union action, one of the departments which are within the company which will go out and start to look at solving the situation will be human resources. So the HR manager, the chief HR manager, some of the people involved in HR would then start talking to unions, union reps, and they would try and diffuse the situation. So that This particular department might take the lead, but at some stage after decision making is done or discussion that happen for decision making, HR manager would then go across to the management and say, okay, these are the demands, these are the things that we've been able to negotiate, and a decision would be done. So sometimes when you look at dealing with crisis, what we need to be able to do is look at some management procedures. These could be the three-step procedure: pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis. And different departments or people in different departments within the organization would then be required to work and diffuse those particular situations. Now, this particular step, once the problem has been faced, in order to avoid that this problem is not faced in the future, a company would put some sort of a crisis management plan in place. And that would mean that they would look at pre-planning. They would look at ensuring that this pre-planning is robust enough for it to not have this particular component process or some sort of service fail. At some stage, they will also be looking at managing crisis. Like sometimes what happens is, if there is a crisis which has happened within the organization, you would see the PR department or the top person within the organization doing an immediate television interview to say, okay, this is the problem which has happened. I think if you look at, there was a problem with WhatsApp and Instagram and some of the Facebook related things because of the server issue. And what the PR managers within the organization, technical team within the organization was, they stepped into action. What they did was essentially try to manage the crisis, saying that, okay, some changes in the servers which were done did not get propagated properly into data centers, and that is what led to the outage. So what they try to do is provide some reasoning behind why this issue has happened, and they look at quickly this issue can be resolved. And that tends to happen in step 2. And the third step would be to look at a bit of damage control, to learn some of the lessons which help them in avoiding some of these mistakes or problems that can again happen in the future. And this tends to be something that we do in our personal lives as well. So if you have a problem, let me give you a simple example, just to explain this 3-step process. When we were a child, and you were trying to learn bicycling, or maybe trying to, you weren't aware that this is fire, what you do is you put your hand over it, and your hand gets burned out, immediately put it back, and then your body learns through that reaction that this is something which is dangerous. If I hand over it, it will burn my skin, and you don't do that again. So what happens, you learn from experience, and what your body then is able to do or emulate is that it understands that this is something which should not be done, and if it's done, it's going to lead to or create a bit of harm, or it will burn a particular thing. So that we do cycling, swimming, some of the reflex actions that our body develops is a outcome or end result of what is called this 3-step crisis management. Sometimes you're not aware as a kid, you're not aware of these situations, and what tends to happen is you go along with it, and then some stage, if there is something which does happen, that means you had a nasty fall, for example, you break a leg, you break a bone, but obviously after getting through this particular crisis, what you do is you learn that, okay, these things cannot be done, or they have to be done under supervision or things like that, and that helps you manage that particular side of the situation. A similar aspect of that typically happens within an organization. And if you just do a context in a business, when we look at from a point of view of any business, you generally see there are problems, issues which arise, and what companies do is, or organizations do is, they put this simple framework to use, and this allows us to resolve problems, make sure lessons are learned, and to avoid them in the future. Or if they do face this problem, they look at mitigating them in the best possible way to be able to overcome some of these and not face them again. And that would be the process through which we learn what is the case of crisis management. Is that okay? Any questions on this so far? Yeah, any questions at your end? Okay, so what we'll do is stop here as we've covered the basic bits of the 3 assessment areas. By the medic, it talks about using PESTEL analysis. So I'm going to send you an email and obviously upload on Moodle a small case study using one of the organizations, because here what we want to do is, in order to gain merit, what you have to now do is take an example to explain PESTEL analysis, like I've done here in this particular slide. So what I've done is I've taken an example of PESTEL analysis, and it is using PESTEL analysis. You have to explain what factors are being faced by a particular organization. To achieve distinction, what we have to do is make recommendations of how that organization would do away with those mitigating factors, and you have to do this for a specific organization. And then the second distinction thing in terms of the criteria is how do you look at specifically coming out of those crises. So you have to come up with some creative ideas, looking at doing a PESTEL analysis, and then coming up with recommendations to say that this is the way through which the organization essentially could avoid a specific crisis. So here is where you would need to use the 3-step crisis management procedure, but use it for a specific organization. And this would allow you to achieve the second distinction criteria. So always what I'm going to do is after the session, I'm going to email you, and obviously put it on Moodle, these additional tasks, which are going to be some handouts or documents, and they will allow you to, better understand how to look at attempting and achieving the merit and distinction criteria. If you have any questions regarding this session, do feel free to drop me an email, and that will be done, primarily on learner work, which is basically a specific query or a question that you have, and that would allow, any. Obviously, I'm teaching this unit. I'll probably drop and pick up this email and drop you a response pretty much straight away. But this allows other tutors to also do that, so that you don't, you're not waiting for a few hours or a couple of days to get a response with regards to the session which happened today. So thanks for joining, and I'll catch up with you tomorrow. Bye. Bye for now.